Power, which means we're going to go ahead and get this meeting started. Good evening. My name is Kelly O'Rourke, and I have a pleasure of serving as a Customer Relations Program Manager with Pasadena Water and Power. Thank you for joining us for this evening's Power Integrated Resource Plan, also known as Power IRP, second community meeting. This is the second in a series of community meetings on the Power IRP that will continue throughout the year. A recording of the first meeting is on our website at pwpweb.com/Power IRP. Public participation is vital to this process. Both residential and commercial customers are strongly encouraged to participate, and we're incredibly thankful for your participation today. This meeting is being recorded. A recording of this meeting will be posted on PWP's website next week. This evening, leadership in PWP's power supply team will give a presentation about the Power IRP. Within the presentation, there will be opportunities for questions. If you would like to ask a question, please type your question into the chat at any time, or you can raise your hand and we'll call on you during the Q&A breaks. We'll call on as many people as time permits, so thank you for keeping your question to about 1 minute to ensure that everyone gets a chance to participate. For more information on the Power IRP and other PWP initiatives, please visit pwpweb.com or follow us on social media. We're on Facebook at Pasadena Water and Power and Twitter at PWP News. You can also sign up for our monthly e-newsletters available for residential and commercial customers at pwpweb.com/stay connected. At this time, I'd like to introduce PWP's Assistant General Manager of Power Supply, Ms. Kelly Nguyen.
Hello and good evening. Welcome to the 2023 Power Integrated Resource Plan, or IRP, Community Meeting number 2. Thank you all for joining us this evening. My name is Kelly Nguyen, Assistant General Manager of Power Supply. PWP, we take the IRP process very seriously, and this is why we have staff dedicated to this effort. We have also retained a consulting firm with substantial IRP experience working in lockstep with PWP staff to develop an IRP that is accurate and comprehensive as possible. The IRP is Pasadena's long-range blueprint for supplying reliable and environmentally responsible electricity at competitive rates. This evening, our staff will bring you up to date on the progress of PWP's IRP study. We'll also take your questions and comments about the IRP both during and after the meeting. Thank you very much for your interest and attendance. We look forward to hearing your thoughts. I will now hand it over to our IRP Project Manager and Principal Resources Planner at PWP, John Hermosi, who comes to us with over 40 years of industry experience.
Thank you very much, Kelly and Kelly. And we're glad to have you all attending here. This is one of these examples of what I call having more equaling better. The more who participate in meetings such as this, the better the quality of the result, I believe. Can everybody hear me? One person can tell me. Good. So, as you can probably tell, it takes a bunch of people to put this together, and just a few of them are shown here on the screen. And it's not only customer relations and power supply, but in the production of the IRP, we will have our finance division involved, power distribution, among others. And we also are grateful to have with us tonight Nettie Brox. Nettie represents ACES, the IRP contractor, who will be putting this together for Pasadena, working with Pasadena to produce the report. And of course, all the studies and analysis that go into it. Since not all of you may have been at the first public town hall meeting, we are going to quickly review. a few basics, very, very basics, less than we did the first time, just to make sure that everybody is up to speed. This will be in the first section that you see on the screen and in part of the second section. I'll try to make this very quick, but this will allow people to refresh their memories. It certainly helps mine, and to allow for questions on the basics before we get into the IRP proper. You'll see information, new information, I hope, in the second portion and in all of the third portion for those of you who are members of the public tuning into us. The idea here is to devote most of this evening to questions and answers. Tell us what you think. Pose a question, have us explain things, and we'll do our best. So that's going to be the majority of tonight. In order to make it the majority of the night, let me move on to the presentation proper. You heard a description of how we're going to deal with questions. The chat feature, I understand, is the one we're going to be using tonight. For those of you who like to type out your questions, of course, for those of you who like to speak your questions, we'll do that during the Q&A period. We will attempt to address every question. We'll do our best. And if you're giving an oral question, please raise your hand, the Zoom feature. Again, keeping your question short will allow for the maximum amount of participation by you, the public. And if we take care of everybody in the public who's in attendance tonight, you'll have even further chances to speak. So don't worry, speaking, your voice will be heard. So let's get into the Integrated Resource Plan proper, the IRP. It is our blueprint for the future power supply of Pasadena. We study how to put together this blueprint by looking at a couple of things. One, where we are now and where we're going to be if we don't do anything in the coming years of this IRP. And I can already tell you in the coming years, many of our resources will, for one reason or another, go away. So they'll have to be replaced in some form or another. The other thing it will do is to do computer modeling via scenarios. Scenarios are cases of end result conditions, if you will. The IRPs in general are required of utilities such as us every 5 years by the California Energy Commission. So at the very tail end of this process, when the report's done, reviewed, approved, and blessed by our city council, the next place it goes is to Sacramento for California Energy Commission review and hopefully filing on PWP's behalf. We need to do this at least every 5 years, and we've been doing it more frequently than that. We are trying to find in this future energy supply a group of resources which put together address the changing environmental milieu, our atmosphere, our set of conditions, the world in which we live. And that is telling us to change our current list of resources and replace that with those that are, for the very most part and eventually completely, replace them with renewable energy and or zero carbon sources. It needs to be done in such a way that our power system remains reliable so that we continue effortlessly and outagelessly supplying energy to our ratepayers, our customers, and to do it in as affordable cost as possible, at as affordable cost as possible. And that's no mean feat. If we can do all of that, we will have achieved a sustainable energy mix, our resource portfolio for the future. For those of you who like tables, this is a way of showing in one graphic what the applicable laws and regulations are that are going to be driving this IRP. Most of what you see here are Senate bills and Assembly bills. That's what SB and AB stand for. These are state of California laws which lead to regulations that utilities such as PWP, publicly owned utilities, need to follow. They are requirements for clean energy, so carbon-free and renewable, also for emissions reductions. The benchmark is 1990, and how far below that number and how quickly we get below that number, we can go in specified years. Therefore, there are milestones that are shown there. You see most of the milestones on the left part of the screen. If you look at the part that shows PWP tracking as the column, you can see how well we've done so far. So this is our emissions reduction performance, if you will. The 2022 and 2030 numbers are predicted numbers. 2022 because the official numbers haven't come in yet. 2030 is a projection based on what we're doing right now. On the right side of the screen are the definitions of the renewable portfolio standard and the clean energy standard. So in the context of this IRP, when we talk about renewable energy and clean energy, you can see what we mean. At the bottom center of this screen, as the last navigation I promise I'll give you on this screen, we talk about Resolution 9977. That is the City of Pasadena's climate emergency resolution. And more on that very briefly. You're going to see that soon. And there it is. The climate emergency resolution, which is in effect a City of Pasadena policy requirement upon PWP, contains several parts. It says there is a climate emergency. It makes that declaration in the body of the resolution. It also sets forth the policy goal for the City of Pasadena to reach 100% carbon-free energy in its power supply to Pasadena PWP customers by the end of calendar year 2030. How are we going to do that? The resolution goes on to say how we might do that. And it recognizes the IRP as that blueprint I was talking about a moment ago to identify ways to do this and says, please find multiple ways or multiple pathways in the verbiage of the resolution to do that. And it mentions the same concurrent goals that we talked about in the previous slide. Keep the power system reliable, keep the supply to our ratepayers affordable, and where necessary, take measures to achieve rate equity. Keep the power supply stable and resilient against whatever Mother Nature and Father Time can throw at us. In future slides in this presentation, you'll see the designation CF 2030. All that means is, according to the goals set forth in this resolution, according to carbon-free by 2030, this is what will happen. So that is a contextual clue that you're going to see in many of the slides to come. Having said that, are there any questions or comments? We'll break for a few minutes for that. Again, you can use the chat feature or you can ask your questions live. Do we have any questions yet?
We do, John. Hi, it's Kelly O. We had a couple questions in the chat. So I'm going to start with those, and I'm going to encourage anyone who would like to ask their question live to use the raise hand feature that you can see on the bottom of your screen on your kind of toolbar there in the Zoom. It's a little hand that looks like that. Okay, so let's start at the very beginning. It says, on January 30th, the City Council unanimously approved Resolution 9977, quote, declaring a climate emergency and setting a goal to source 100% of Pasadena's electricity from carbon-free sources by 2030, end quote. What immediate, short-term, and long-term actions is PWP taking to respond to this direction from the City Council?
Let's begin with a short term. With a short term, we are not even waiting for the production of an IRP to see the handwriting on the wall, which directs PWP to replenish and advance its supply of carbon-free energy and renewable energy. We have put into place a contract which will begin supply in a couple of years to give us solar energy, which combined with an on-site battery system will make it more reliable and increase its capacity value to Pasadena. That installation is going to be somewhere in Southern California, and the ink is dry on the contract to do that. We have another contract that we are hoping to ink very, very soon. It will be presented to the Municipal Services Committee and or to the City Council, depending upon when we can schedule this, for a geothermal energy supply. Again, this is multi-years. And this is coming from a location in Northern California. And those two facilities, the solar plus battery and the geothermal, will start filling in the gap that is now created when our resources, the majority of which by weight are fossil fueled, go away. And those will happen, start the flow toward Pasadena before the year 2030. The IRP will give us also ideas as to what to buy, what to build. We are working on a very real project to build some battery storage inside Pasadena at the current Glenarm power plant site to start storing energy in Pasadena. The idea being that when renewable energy comes our way, we can store it there and then distribute it locally in the city so that we have a reliable supply of renewable energy. Once again, we're doing this in advance of 2030 and not waiting for the direction of the IRP. Now, in the long term, we look at the direction of the IRP to tell us what more we should do in what areas, what resource types, and by what time. And while we're building the part, we know we're generating the blueprint for the future. So that's what we're doing now and for the farther future.
Thank you, John. How does PWP's reliability compare with that of SCE?
I wish I had the numbers in front of me, but I know that it is. I know that PWP has the lowest or one of the lowest failure rates on the consumer side of the system among the utilities around us. SCE's is pretty good, I have to say. We can look up the exact numbers, but I know it's in the same general ballpark. I won't say if it's better or worse right now, but anecdotally, I think it might be a little bit better. So it's definitely comparable, and it is better than that of most of the publicly owned utilities around us. So right now, we are very reliable by that measure. In terms that by measure, I mean the outage rate and outage duration of energy supplied to our customers they're both quite low numbers right now.
Thank you, John. So I just wanted to put a point of information, we had a question in the chat or a comment. It appears that the City Council's mandate for 100% carbon-free energy is missing from the slide. It has its own slide, which is what is being shown here. Are the benchmarks for the SBs also based in 1990?
The only one that's based on 1990 is the GHG emissions. And going to this slide, that's what you see in the lower right-hand portion of the screen. And greenhouse gases are not only CO2, but also other gases with the greenhouse effect or the ozone depletion impact of CO2. For example, sulfur hexafluoride, which is used very often in utility operations, is quite a bit more potent than CO2, and it's included in this regulation. Methane is included in this regulation also with a higher impact on the ozone layer than CO2 does. So this number is all combining that all together when it comes from an identified source as logged in 1990, and that is the benchmark that we're using. But it is only for 1990 is only for emissions. The other percentages you see in the upper left-hand portion of the screen is for the total energy supply, and there you're talking about the megawatts, if you will, of installed power.
Thank you, John. John, we have a question here. How many cities made the same carbon-free commitment as Pasadena? Has any other utility accomplished this goal thus far?
To my knowledge, no cities around Pasadena have accomplished this. In fact, you won't know unless they've accomplished a 2030 goal already by 2023. We will not know. To my knowledge, none of them has around Pasadena in Southern California. Very few, I think it's like 1 or 2 out of dozens, have a carbon emission standard that is a clean energy standard. In other words, the carbon free by 2030 that Pasadena does. I can tell you anecdotally that there are a couple of utilities, I believe, in Washington State that have set a clean energy standard and have already met it. It's because they're 100% small hydro already, and they met the standard before they declared it. Pasadena is not in that position right now. So we are very much at the forefront. We have just about the most stringent requirements of any of our neighbors around us. And no, none of our neighbors around us have achieved that goal. They're all more or less in the same boat as we are.
Thank you, John. This is a two-parter. Can you assure us that you will meet the commitment for 100% carbon-free energy by 2030? How will you assure Pasadeneans that you take the climate emergency as an immediate existential threat?
Well, let me answer the second part first. So the city has declared in its climate emergency resolution that climate change is an existential threat. So we are following the guidelines that are given to us, the goal of the city, with the same degree of seriousness on that. So it is, we say we're doing it because it's very, very important to the city on that level. We got to do it. I hope we're not all going to die because of it, but we apply the same level of essential effort to this as if that were actually the case. As far as being able to accomplish the goal, nobody can guarantee it who hasn't done it yet. Nobody at all. We will certainly do our best to make that a reality. And we are making a level effort to show through the IRP how it can be done, and in more than one way.
Thank you, John. I have one more question that I'm going to read out loud here, John, and then we have two people with their hands raised, and then we'll either proceed and save these questions for the next question and answer, or we can come back to me and I can read some more out loud.
Okay.
So
it's been 10 minutes so far. So why don't we do those,
okay.
and then we'll continue on
Okay.
until the next Q&A break.
Great.
Yes.
Thank you, John. That sounds like a great plan. So I'm going to read one more question here, and then I see Roddy, and then Donna Sider is going to
and then
follow Roddy, please.
And then following Donna will be Bob Conley.
Okay, great. Thank you. The City Council resolved that Pasadena electricity will be 100% carbon free by the end of 2030. Please explain the steps you are taking now to meet that target and the ways the Integrated Resource Plan will commit Pasadena to being part of the climate solution on the local level. Are there any PWP guidelines for residents to conserve power?
Okay. Just as a point of correction, the City Council did not promise that PWP or the city will be 100% carbon free by 2030. What they did in the resolution is to set the goal. Try your best. Make that a target. Aim for it. We, the council, direct you, PWP, to do your best to make that happen. And that's what we're planning to do. So just to make that clear, the city council is like everybody else, I said, who cannot guarantee a given result that has not yet occurred, but as we realize the importance of doing it, making it happen, so they have directed us to make that our goal. The other part is, what are Pasadenans doing already? Long answer to that question, but the short version of it is that they are receiving rebates to install rooftop solar and install local storage. They are taking efforts to conserve, not only to lower their bills in good times, but to lower demand in bad times. When we had a heat wave in September of last year, and the state of California was perilously close to widespread blackouts, Pasadenans were among those who heeded the call, and many of them saw this show up as alerts on their smartphones to reduce load. That was a large factor toward bringing the state of California over the hump. So we see the spirit of voluntary participation already among Pasadenans. We do hope that in this future blueprint, there will be at least the same spirit of participation in reducing load through conservation and in becoming a part of the energy supply through what we call distributed generation. That's putting more generation and storage on the customer side of the meter. So believe it or not, that's a short version of the answer. Did I cover everything on that question?
Thank you, John. At this time, I'm going to invite Roddy Stevenson to unmute and ask your question live.
Okay, very good. My name is pronounced Rody, by the way.
Thank you, Rody.
Rody and not Roddy. Anyway, minor detail. Right now, Pasadena has a fair amount of fossil fuel energy coming from Utah at the IPP, the Intermountain Power Plant. Could you bring us up to date with the latest plans for getting out of that? I think that contract expires in 2027. I believe you might get out of that contract in 2025, and they're promising to build some hydrogen storage or a new plant up there and get natural gas and get off coal. Anyway, I know the city council voted a couple of years or so ago not to sign up any long-term contracts with that place. But what is the current status of that? And do you believe they're going to accomplish their goal of getting off coal? And are you going to buy some of it in your IRP?
You're absolutely right, Roddy. City of Pasadena has negotiated a contract with the Intermountain Power Authority to pull out of the Intermountain Power Project. And the way that we're pulling out of the Intermountain Power Project is to take no more energy from IPP in whatever form after a certain date in 2027. Between 2025 and 2027, IPP will be repowering. That's replacing generation from coal-fired to natural gas-fired, and then blending in hydrogen as much as they can through various percentages to create, hopefully, eventually, full hydrogen-powered turbine generation. Pasadena's take on this is going to be through the conversion process to take energy from the new units, but only to count it as natural gas generation. Pasadena will not be sticking around for the conversion to hydrogen, which is going to take numerous years after 2027 to accomplish. We won't be around for that. We have decided to go through our own path and not to rely upon IPP for anything. Bear in mind, most hydrogen now, like over 95%, comes from fossil fuel sources. And it will be a separate project on IPP to be able to get their hydrogen from renewable energy sources. That will not happen immediately either. So while all that's happening, Pasadena is saving its money, getting out of the project, investing in, which will be more likely more local resources to Pasadena within the state of California, probably, and resources that by and large, maybe entirely, we'll see what the results of the IRP will tell us, don't rely upon using hydrogen, but we'll see that.
As you know, the hydrogen conversion, as you know, is problematic. They want to, I think, store it in some sort of salt dome or something you have up there. And there are different kinds of hydrogen. There is green hydrogen, which is made from electrolysis and is just as green as solar energy. And then there's blue hydrogen, which is might be transported around the world in the form of ammonia. And there's gray hydrogen, and that was made from natural gas. And there's black hydrogen made from coal or something like that. So there's 3 or 4 different kinds of hydrogen from different ultimate sources. But if you can get green hydrogen, there's nothing wrong with it. And I thought IPP was going to put in a big solar farm or something to power this thing.
Which is a separate project.
Separate project.
In fact, I saw 2 separate projects that are now being proposed adjacent to IPP, and that would tie into its switch rack.
Yeah.
So they're doing that, but that's not part of the IPP contract in which Pasadena is involved, even today.
Okay, and as you know, DWP.
Actually, this is Robert Castro. Could we pivot back to Roddy, perhaps after we hear some of the other people who are have their hands raised? I didn't want to have too many.
Excuse us, Roddy. Please hold that thought, and we'll get back to you the next time you're up.
I'm going to ask Donna S. Please unmute yourself and ask your question. Thank you for keeping your question to a minute or less so that we can have as many people participate as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, and good evening. My blood pressure is already up as I circle back to my question. I am a solar residential owner that was installed in 2006. So my question does have to do with there were so many questions I wanted to ask now that I have been called upon. All right, here we go. Here's Peter's. Here's Tony's. Excuse me, host, can you read the one that I put on the chat, please?
Yes.
Okay.
Is this the I support or the one on the Q&A?
Q&A, thanks.
Thank you. Kelly?
So Donna is asking here says, it seems like a mistake to cap local energy from residential rooftop solar rather than incentivizing it when we need reliable energy independent of the grid. My home's solar installed in 2006. Please address my question.
Okay, it is a common misconception in Pasadena that the development of residential solar is capped. The cap that we talk about has to do with the net energy metering program, which affects your rates. So we will be encouraging, one way or another, we will be encouraging Pasadenas to install more distributed energy. We have not established a real cap on that development yet. But this begs another question as to what the rate deal will be. How will this be metered in the future? As you may have heard, net energy metering 3.0 is about to be initiated. And here we are in Pasadena working on net energy metering version 1.0. So that's really two questions. One of them is, what do we do? How do we address the current participants in Pasadena who are being metered and billed under net energy metering version 1.0? And then how do we work with those who wish to install more renewable energy, say solar panels on rooftops, and new installations where there wasn't anything before? Apart from NEM 1.0. So
why don't I drill back down? I'm so sorry to interrupt, Mr.
Yes,
Hormozi.
sorry, go ahead.
It's not a personal question. Mm-hmm. I don't think I've really gotten back. And of course, as you can tell by the date, I should be grandfathered into the very first version. However, yes. I read in the LA Times today that the state of California, as in the three big power companies, are looking at a very different solution, i.e., charging those who can afford to pay for rates, and then having a tiered system for those who really cannot and on whose backs, right? So much of our policy making falls. I'm talking about those who do not typically have a voice to speak for themselves. Okay, so I have a neighbor, who has worked for PUSD her entire career. This is the important thing. Okay, that we're not doing this for the wealthy as so much as Pasadena runs around. And I'm very disappointed, Mr. Hormozi, by you saying we didn't promise. We will never let you get away with that. Okay, we're here on this screen. I'm looking at Sam Burt, Cynthia Canley, Bob Nolte, Peter Eisenberg. All of these people are known to me and have been working incredibly hard. Sandy Krasner, excuse me, Sandy, incredibly hard, sir, on behalf of the efforts that got this through. First the WP and then the full city council. And don't think you can now sit there on your position and tell this group of people that you didn't promise. So let me end there and let some other people take the floor.
Actually, let me jump to the defense of Mr. Hormozi. He was just reiterating what was in the resolution. And our goal is to try and reach the 2030. And we have a number of our scenarios are aimed towards that. And they will be presented to the city council, and they will make the decision as to what the direction we will go. Right now, we are following their directives, and Mr. Hormozi is leading that effort in a very professional manner. And he was just actually identifying what was in the resolution and what our goals are. Again, we aren't promising anything because it's not our place to promise. It is the city council, and they will be offering the policy. So again, this is not our decision. We are going to propose it to city council, and they will look at everything. And we have heard your voice and the voice of other STAG members. we are going to be looking at a number of different ways of going forward. So I just wanted to clarify that aspect. We're not trying to sneak anything by. So
thank you, Mr. Castro. And I have Mr. Bob Connolly in the wings.
Hello. I'm curious. I'm a little heartened to hear that the City Council dictate is a goal, not a locked in 2030 number. Are you or is anybody in the food chain doing calculations on the trade-offs between expected loss of life from the hypothetical climate impacts versus loss of life from unreliable electricity? And, up in the Bay Area, when they had their blackout last, I forget when it was, but it was in the last 6 or 7 months, tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars worth of property were lost by virtue of unreliable energy. And so I'm trying to get some sort of a handle on if anyone is doing any set of any consideration to the trade-offs between reliable and unreliable energy in order to meet a mandate, which it turns out is not a mandate.
Thank you, Bob, for the question. In terms of loss of life, I'm assuming you're talking about loss of human and animal life, loss of living life. When you say that, the various.
Not sure what other kind of life there is, but go ahead.
Okay.
Oh, you mean like plant life and stuff?
As opposed to loss of equipment life, things running down faster than I think I know what you mean.
10x more important human life, but also
I think that's
very real issues with machine. I mean, our modern society and our machines rely on are built on reliable energy, and the terrible toll that repeated blackouts, which, if you look at the graph you guys put up last time, where there's this gap developing over the next 2 years that just widens and widens between reliable electricity and unreliable, it just looks like we're headed down a road to absolute catastrophe.
There are two ways to look at that, two dimensions, which we in the IRP are going to try to view simultaneously. One of them is the threat, and I mean that existentially, the threat to Pasadenans due to loss of reliability of energy of any sort coming to them. Imagine somebody with a dialysis machine at home.
That's exactly a great
something
example.
like that. Exactly.
Amen.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So building an unreliable power system, I can tell you right now, even before the IRP is finished, is not an option. It must be reliable. That's why it's right up there with environmental stewardship and affordability. We're going to aim for all three targets simultaneously. Now, from the environmental point of view, there is a threat to people and the environment in which they live through climate change. And various institutions have studied that. What we're using in the IRP to view that is what's called the social cost of carbon. The particular index that we're using in the IRP comes from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, which tried to put a dollar amount on the pain, the damage due to the threat of climate change, and express that in dollars per metric ton of CO2 issued. The IRP will study the social cost of carbon when it comes to dispatching decisions in the simulations in the IRP. And that's how we're going to assess that. We're going to take a look at it that way.
Hi, John. Thank you. We're running out of time, so we might need to take one more question and then move on to our next session.
That we announced that Bob was going to be our last question, but I do see Alan B. and David, and I'll call on you first for the next round, or you can type your question in the chat in case.
Excellent. Let's move on, and let's move on so we can get to the presentation and then all the remaining questions. Let's talk about the power resource portfolio. Shortly after we begin here, this will be all new material for those who have logged in with us before in these meetings. Okay, very quick review. If you're the difference between power and energy. Energy is like a quantity of useful material. In this case, think Einstein, E equals mc squared, where energy and mass can be related to each other. Well, here's the energy component of it. If it were hypothetically compared to mass, it would be like water in a bucket. Power is the rate at which the bucket is filled. So power relates to the capacity, how much capability we have in our power system. Energy is the actual product of that power system that's delivered to end users. Power is measured in megawatts, kilowatts, watts. Energy is measured in megawatt hours, kilowatt hours, and watt hours. If we were running our current resources at the levels where they had been run in recent years, but we allow for carbon-free by 2030. Let me say this right. Yep, that's what it looks like. Take those two together. And we have what we call a resource stack with the for sure energy at the bottom, our resources. And then we stack on top the next thing we'd run, until we meet our load. Our annual load is represented by this red line. So with that proviso, if we were running things the way we had run them in previous years, this is how much energy would be produced. This is not actually how much energy we produce, because we can stop at this line. What happens when we stop at this line? We don't use the remainder here. So in 2022, 23, and in the next few years, you can expect that we won't be using the portion here that you see above the red line. That portion is coal energy. We are indeed backing down our coal take from Intermountain Generating Station. And as time goes on, you'll see that our ability to supply energy now is dropping off as our resources drop off, until and unless we do things to it. So this is a picture from an energy point of view of really where we stand today without further changes, and realizing that this is what would have happened but will not happen, because all we need to do is serve energy, which is this red line over here. Talked about power. Power relates to resource adequacy. Resource adequacy, in turn, is the ability to supply energy. It's like energy insurance. Oh, I'm sure I have energy. Why? Because I have this generator at my home. If the power goes out, being supplied by PWP, which, by the way, it almost never does, then I have this backup source. That backup source for me as a customer is the rating of that generator. It's like energy insurance. It's there when it's needed, on standby. Different resources have different values of RA, which is the countability, how much you can count on that particular type of resource to supply energy on demand. And you'll see on this end of the scale, not so much dependability, which relates to reliability, on solar and wind without doing anything to it, such as storage. And then sort of on the middle of the scale, hydro, because that is governed by how much water is available to go through the turbines upstream of the power plant. You have geothermal here and fossil fuels here that supply the most RA when they're installed, not necessarily running, but they're on standby. So this is a picture of RA. This is something that is an index for us to measure the reliability of whatever resource portfolio we put together in the future as we study in the IRP. So when you look at our current position from a reliability point of view, you come up with this we come up with this graph. Again, this graph is defined in terms of the type of resource. And notice there's a change here in that, yes, indeed, the vast majority of Pasadena's resource adequacy is coming from natural gas. And most of our natural gas resource is the Glenarm Power Plant. On there, the 5 units there. Now, under the carbon-free by 2030 goal, that goes away after 2030, and we're left with these resources that we currently have and that we're going to have to build upon to get to this red line. This red line represents the resource adequacy that we are going to be expected to maintain. And as Pasadena's electrical load grows over time, this red line is creeping upwards over time to, roughly speaking, and we'll refine this in the IRP process, a number like 375 megawatts. So this is where we currently are positioned from a reliability point of view. Let's talk about the renewable energy part of the triangle. Yes, renewable energy can be measured. It's measured in renewable energy credits. For example, a photovoltaic solar plant will generate 1 renewable energy credit to measure the environmental value of that energy for every megawatt hour that it puts out. Not so for, say, a fossil fuel powered resource such as coal. A coal-fired power plant such as Intermountain Generating Station is good for putting out megawatt hours of coal energy, but produces absolutely no RECs, renewable energy credits. This is just one index of measuring how renewable a power system is used. As a matter of fact, it's become so popular that RECs can't be traded, detached, reattached, sold, resold. They're always tracked, but they have a value on their own. So, for example, if somebody had not theoretically, this happens in the industry, say a fossil fueled resource, and for every megawatt hour that it puts out, buys a REC, they can have credit for that much renewable energy. What essentially they're doing is, by buying the REC, they're paying somebody else to generate renewable energy and taking the credit for that, which then the developer receives as a prize, a reward for generating that renewable energy. It works. That's how it works out. And there are requirements placed on Pasadena's with other utilities on the renewable content that appeared in our earlier slide on the percentages that we have to reach. So that's just one way of measuring how environmentally responsive a utility is in providing power supply. When you look at Pasadena's resource portfolio from an environmental point of view, you come up with this chart. Again, it's broken down by type of technology. The red line represents the requirements that are placed upon PWP, and the bars represent the accumulation of different types of renewable resources that make that up. You can see that we're pretty responsive and in pretty good shape through 2024, but we began to lag behind in 25 and 26 for a couple of years. And then we pick up again when a geothermal contract that we know about kicks in. And we're okay for a year or so until we need to fill in this gap once again. So that's where we are currently on an environmental point of view. Time for another question and answer break. Thank you for your patience and waiting to get back to us, especially with apologies to those we had to cut off. And now we can get back to you.
Alan B., please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, hi. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. Very interesting meeting. I'm glad to that you set up something so that we could be a part of this process. Thank you. One thing I noticed from some previous speakers is a sense of fear. It seemed like a sense of fear about unreliable power going forward based on some of these charts you showed us, and also questioning the promise or intentions of PWP. And I don't have, my sense of it is that PWP is well-intentioned and is certainly looking to do everything it can to meet that 100% clean energy by 2030. So, but in the graphs that were scaring some people really represent the challenge that PWP has to meet. And PWP is taking that on. So it's my hope that people will spend less of their energy haranguing PW, say John in particular this evening, about his promise, and take an attitude of how can we help come up with solutions to this problem, to where are we going to find this clean power, because we need a ton of it. So apologies for my editorializing aside. My question, I have three, but to stick with one, John, in the February meeting, I think you mentioned that you said that Pasadena is, in practical terms, its own community choice aggregator. Obviously, we need to promote lots of solar, get it on rooftops. Obviously, we can't cover 40% of Pasadena, but there's a lot of empty roofs. And so your comment that Pasadena is, in practical terms, its own community source aggregator, is that to imply that Pasadena can own distributed energy resources on rooftops around the city, or would it still need a third-party aggregator to sort of to do that if they were going to go that route, to aggregate solar on rooftops and sell and provide it to the city as a reliable source?
Interesting question, Alan. To keep it short, PWP is not contemplating expropriating people's roofs to own their roofs and therefore put the solar panels on them, or even necessarily to put PWP owned solar on other people's roofs. Although technically and financially that is a possibility, that's not our main intent, and it may not turn out to be that way. We're looking at various ways to encourage distributed generation, but in the main, that distributed generation would be owned by the folks who have it installed. In this case, by the ratepayers. It would be their generation, and all they'd be doing is selling the output essentially to PWP. It would have to be in a reliable way, so PWP can count on that, as with any other reliable resource, or if you will, to gauge it in terms of the reliability value of that resource. So no, we're not planning to go into the real estate business, but we are planning to encourage more Pasadenans to put on rooftop solar.
Great. I didn't mean to imply that you would expropriate rooftops, and I think that you were being humorous there.
Yes.
But even if people do that, for instance, just as a follow-up, that is often a small part of a rooftop, or there's a lot more roof space that could be used that's more than the individual household needs. So is PWP open to community choice, to aggregators coming in and finding ways, creative ways, using the market to increase the amount of solar panel on rooftops?
It sounds like is PWP thinking of hiring somebody to coordinate this process. We have not done so yet, to my knowledge, and that's not part of the plan. If we ever do it, it would be a policy decision. The first thing that the IRP is trying to answer is how much of it do we need? And then it will give ideas on how to do it. Currently in our thinking, that's not one of those ideas. It's one of those things that is possible, but it doesn't mean it's going to happen that way. Right now, we're thinking along the lines of let the ratepayers deal with PWP directly when installing their rooftop solar.
Got it.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you, John. David, you're up.
Thank you so much. Appreciate that. I actually have a couple of questions, but I'll power through them quickly here for the sake of time. The first one is around, you talked about potential battery energy storage system at Glenarm facility. And I put this question in the chat, but my questions are kind of, what are you envisioning? Is this something where PWP would be developing it or bringing in a third party, a developer with experience in the space of doing that? Would it be something where PWP would be owning it? They just would be handling the design and build if you are using a third party, or would they be a developer who would own it? They'd lease the land. Kind of what are we thinking size-wise, or do you have answers to any of these questions yet?
Okay.
Okay. Like how far along have we gotten in the thinking?
Okay. Yeah, it hasn't happened yet, Dave, but this is what we're thinking. We're thinking of having more solar carports being built. And if they were to be built, it would not be on PWP owned land. We don't have that much land. Maybe or maybe not on city owned land. The city doesn't own the majority of land in Pasadena, I think.
Right.
It would be on privately owned land. The land would still belong to the property owner. The idea is to build a carport over a parking lot, or series of carports more exactly over a parking lot, and then to put solar panels on top of the carport. Who owns the carport is something that we have yet to decide. A majority of the cost of a solar carport is the carport itself, not the solar panels.
Okay,
the thought
I'm sorry
is,
John, in the interest of time, I'm going to interrupt, and I apologize.
Go right ahead.
Being
Yes.
rude.
Yes.
I was actually asking about. Maybe I misunderstood. I thought earlier you were talking about a BESS, or battery energy storage system, like large scale. Utility scale energy storage at the Glenarm site.
Yes, we are.
Okay.
We are actually working on an
RFP.
RFP. We're actually working on an RFP to issue. Yes.
Okay. So how does that tie to the solar carports?
It doesn't. It's something separate and in addition to that.
Okay. So I'm sorry. So there's an RFP out for a battery energy storage system.
Not issued yet, but hopefully to be issued soon.
Okay, so then my question, and I apologize that I was unclear earlier. My question's around that proposal, that with the pending RFP. What are we thinking? I say we as the collective Pasadena, but what is the thinking for how this would be developed, and who would own and operate it? What the size potential would be? Kind of some of those parameters. Do we have ideas around that?
Okay. Forgive me, David, for speaking only in general terms, not only for the time in our meeting, but also because the RFP hasn't been issued yet. But the idea is that it would be a sort of a pilot project in that the developer would own the equipment, but it would be on PWP land.
Okay, cool. So that makes sense. Thank you for that.
Thank you so much for your question.
One other question, though, I just want to throw out there about slide 15 and load growth, as to what has been factored into it for the load growth calculations, things such as EVs, going all electric for certain buildings, that kind of stuff. I was wondering if you could speak to that quickly, and I'll hop off. Thank you so much for the time, everybody. Appreciate it.
Okay. I would love to answer that question, but so as not to hog the audio here, may I defer to Nettie Brox. Nettie, if you're there, what factors went into the load forecast?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, everyone, for being here. We appreciate the feedback. And so I think there were two components that were questioned. The first is transportation electrification is included in the load forecast. In fact, that accounts for most of the growth in the load forecast over time. And secondly, building electrification and fuel substitution is also included in the load forecast. That's typically called additional achievable fuel substitution. And so we are including that in the load forecast. The load forecast also includes considerations of climate change and of other load growth. It also includes considerations of energy efficiency, distributed solar, and distributed storage. John,
Thank
I'm going
you.
to turn it back to you.
Okay,
Thank you,
Nettie.
John, how many megawatts or megawatt hours are on the geothermal contract?
I believe, and Robert can help me out with this, it is 25 megawatts for, what is it, 20 years?
15 years, sir.
15 years. 25 megawatts for 15 years.
Thank you. John, regarding reliability, doesn't most of our power come into the city through the Goodrich station? What is PWP doing in terms of this one potential point of failure, which is indifferent to power source? Are there plans for another point of entry for power?
Let me answer the third question first. Not at the moment. Answering, going to the first part of the question, in terms of energy, the answer is yes, that's true. On the second part, there is a serious plan being put together by our colleagues in power distribution. It's called the Power Distribution Master Plan. It will be summarized and referred to in the IRP. And one of the portions of that master plan is to expand the transformation capability and the power throughput capability of Goodrich Receiving Station.
John, why does PWP no longer offer incentives for residents wanting to install solar systems? I read that on your site.
That is I call that a question yet to be answered. PWP, because I'm not in the rate making section, nor is a recommendation policy-wise going to be part of the IRP, although it will be mentioned on that, the relationship of the incentives to implementation. But I can tell you in general terms, PWP is looking at what to do in the future along the lines of what I told Donna earlier. It's two questions. How do we work in the future with current suppliers of renewable energy from the rooftops? And how do we deal with future suppliers, people who want to add to their systems or have new systems to put in? So that is still an open question. And we'll see the answers to that in the next rate ordinance proposal to be placed to the City Council, which is many, many months off.
Thank you, John. Does the system RA requirement take into account increase in EVs and transitions from residential natural gas to more electric appliances?
I can answer that very quickly. Yes, and yes. And that second yes is fuel substitution.
Thank you, John. Does PWP have intermediate targets for percentage of carbon-free energy between now and 2030?
We are safe to say using internal targets as guidelines as to how well we're doing. Those are not regulatory guidelines, but we're using that as, if you will, a signpost. The best way to look at that for us internally is to look at the REC graph and see that how close we are. Actually, we have to fulfill that REC graph. You have to fulfill that REC graph. And that translates to a percentage of renewable content in our power supply. That's only one of two things. The other thing is carbon-free, which actually adds to that. Carbon-free sources that don't happen to be renewable. So we're looking at that internally, informally, as a guidepost to how well we're doing while at the same time meeting state requirements for REC content, renewable energy credit content of our power supply.
Thank you, John. Does PWP have access to additional clean power available through Southern California Public Power Authority, or SCPPA, sometimes called SCAPA?
Short answer to that question is yes. The longer version is we are working with SCAPA for most of our new renewable energy projects. They were referred to us by SCAPA, and in the majority of the cases are being contracted for us through SCAPA. They have been a great way to assemble offers to sell renewable energy and to participate in projects. They really leverage their power among Southern California public power utilities such as PWP.
Thank you, John. I'm going to do one more before I see someone. I see Ted I has his hand raised. So I'm going to read one more of these and then ask Ted I to get ready to be, because he's on deck. What future weather file will be used for the IRP scenarios, and what is the provenance of that file? In the answer, I'm expecting a specific file name, its source, and the RCP it represents.
That is something that will have to be answered. If you want a specific file like a web address, that's something we'll have to be able to supply offline. But what we do use is regular weather forecasts for the scenarios. And then we have what's called a sensitivity test, which is a situation that we have not seen, but it's an extreme weather event. It's a sensitivity test that would be applied to all scenarios, and that's called heat wave. Did you want to add anything to that, perhaps, Nettie?
Sure. So weather would come under both the load and under the resource assumptions. And so the data source for the load assumptions is the California Energy Demand Update. That's part of the 2022 Integrated Energy Policy Report, or IPER, from the California Energy Commission. For the resource side, the anticipated output of renewable energy resources is dependent on weather. That output usually comes from either developers, so developers estimate, or we're using some output sources that come from Horizons Energy, which is a third-party data provider. And I believe some of the data sets that are used by that provider are from NREL in terms of weather years.
NREL is the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, by the way.
Thank you, Nettie and John. Ted I, please unmute yourself and ask your question. Thank you.
Hi, yeah. My question is about storage again. I'd like to come back to that because it's vital to making the transition work. I'd like to know about your design criteria for the storage. What would be the number of days of load that it would have to sustain, for example? You can offer other criteria, but that seems like an obvious one. Like if all of the energy generating equipment, or at least only the renewables, went down, how many days or hours of load would it have to sustain, and what's the basis for that estimate? And also, what is the complete portfolio of storage technologies? Is heat storage even a contender anymore? Thank you.
Okay. On the first question, to be very brief, the RFP that we're planning to issue is for 25 megawatts for 4 hours. Battery energy storage, which is what we're starting with here in the city of Pasadena, is, if you will, notoriously shortened duration. It's definitely not long-term energy storage and is measured in hours, not weeks or months. So as I said, as a pilot project, Pasadena will need a whole lot more of that to meet its energy needs and its capacity needs moving forward a couple of decades from now. What was the second part of your question, may I ask?
About the total portfolio of technologies that are being considered. I know you mentioned hydrogen.
Thank you, Ted. We have a slide on that. We have a slide on that coming in the next section.
But then also heat. Is heat even a possibility anymore?
Okay, we have a slide covering that exactly, Ted. After you see the slide after the third portion, please feel free to ask us any follow-up questions after you see it.
John, I've been advised that we need to move on with the last portion. Otherwise, we might run up against the clock and not have sufficient time for the remaining information we're trying to get out. So I'm going to hold questions here.
Okay, the third portion has to do with the IRP itself. This is a study that's going to lead into a report. Thank you who are on this call, as well as the Stakeholder Technical Advisory Group, or STAG, the Environmental Advisory Commission of the city, and the Municipal Services Committee, which is a subset of the City Council, in giving us input, feedback, suggestions that are helping to shape the IRP. That is helping us in data assumptions, our inputs, and the scenarios that we're going to model. A word about the STAG. This is a focus group, if you will. It has about 18 people on it. And we have been holding intensive meetings with the STAG 7 times so far. The next one is going to happen in mid-May. And we have in these meetings covered issues, subjects that are listed here: the cost of the resources, data assumptions, the types of resources that we would use, which would answer your question, Ted, the scenarios that we would assume, the sensitivity test. You heard about one of them being a heat wave in Pasadena. We are going to continue meeting with the STAG. The process is not ended yet. They're going to be with us for a while to come, walking along the same path. Now, here's the slide I wanted to show you, Ted. These are the proposed resource types that we're going to use in the IRP. When we say internal, which is the far left side of the screen, that is electrically inside Pasadena. You see the whole list here. And Kelly O, is it correct to say that this entire PowerPoint slide deck is going to be made available through the website so people can look at it at their leisure? If you see it here and I change another slide, you're not going to lose it.
Correct, sir.
Thank you. External resource options means electrically external to Pasadena, which is looking outside Pasadena beyond Goodrich receiving station. In the load forecast, as Nettie showed a few minutes ago in her answer, there are several factors that go into the load forecast. There are certain resource types that we decided through a lot of conversations and feedback not to include in the scenarios, the mainstream scenarios of this IRP, and we'll show you what those mainstream scenarios are. They include nuclear reactors, conversion of Glenarm to use hydrogen, carbon capture for Glenarm. We have for years decided no new fossil fuel resources. Long duration storage is not effectively installable inside Pasadena. Doesn't mean that we're not going to keep our eyes open for opportunities elsewhere in California to buy into projects for that. Tidal power, wave power would make more sense if we were a coastal city, which we're not. I talked about scenarios. Here are the scenarios which we're currently planning to study in this IRP. The first 3 are different flavors of carbon-free by 2030. The 4th one you see is a reference scenario, and we'll get into what each one of these means in individual slides. The reference, last one here on the list is a reference scenario, including a social cost of carbon. We also, thank you, ACES, plan to run an emerging technologies study, which are using technologies that are not available to us now, but might be in the study period of this IRP, what effect those might have. Now, details on the individual scenarios. For your reference, here they appear on a graph as to what factors or features each scenario has. We thrown the emerging technology study in here for comparison as well. It's a handy reference chart. But as for the scenarios themselves, 100% carbon-free with no limit on internal resources means that, bearing in mind the fact that we do have a limitation of throughput at Goodrich, bearing that in mind, but with no cap on the resources that would be located in Pasadena, then what would solve for this situation? What would the resource portfolio be? It should result in a least cost resource portfolio, which is in itself a nice benchmark to compare against other 100% by 2030 scenarios. What if we do put a limit on the amount of internal resources? After all, we have this 23 square mile city, and the vast majority of it is occupied by people and businesses and streets and other things like that. So what could we fit in here? Well, we made an educated guess as to what could possibly potentially be fit inside the city of Pasadena electrically to make a carbon-free by 2030 scenario work. And these are limits that we did for the sake of the study. Put these in, and then what kind of a solution we would get. So take the same idea that you saw in this scenario and add increased rooftop solar and increased installation of customer side batteries compared to what would normally happen. And there is definitely a growth curve on that. What if you double the growth curve? How would that affect everything else in the solution? Now we have an increased participation by distributed energy resources. And what would that scenario look like as a pathway to 100% carbon-free by 2030? We have a reference case, which is to meet all state requirements. And here's a very brief overview summary of what those state requirements are, along with intermediate milestones that are targets for us to meet. The most important one of those is clean energy 100% by 2045 that you see on the screen. So we think that what that's going to do is to recommend more of these lower cost resources, big projects outside the city of Pasadena. Again, we have to be mindful of the Goodrich tie point and how much we could safely bring in out of those. But it would like to pick resources such as this. Take this reference case and throw in the social cost of carbon. By the way, we picked this case because among the scenarios, having the reference case would be, relative to the other scenarios, the most carbon producing case. So if we took that scenario and then applied a social cost of carbon, which I described earlier, then that would make carbon producing resources look to the computer model as more expensive. The model would therefore try to select other resources. And that would give if you will, a preference toward renewable energy, carbon-free energy in the resource stack. So this, compared to that, would tell us what difference applying a social cost of carbon to energy dispatch, especially as it applies before 2030, which is like one of the questions that we received earlier, what effect that would have on the way we operate. And yes, we're using social cost of carbon as calculated from a recognized resource, which is the Environmental Protection Agency. After this, I mentioned an emerging technology study. So this is a standalone study. We will try to model a couple of different technologies that could be applied here. Remember some of those that I mentioned that were not to be considered. In practice, they may show up, but we defined a couple of proxy cases just to fill in the blank, to fill in that megawatt contribution to the resource portfolio. What if we could add this to the resource stack? Technologies that can be developed in the next few years, which is within the study period of this IRP. So we really ought to consider them because they may actually arise and be available to Pasadena. We'll apply that to one of the scenarios. We haven't quite picked which one of the scenarios. We'll apply that to. We are currently gathering feedback and have already received some ideas from the STAG as to which scenario is the best one to apply this to. Sensitivity tests. There are 3 of them contemplated for this IRP. One of them is a heat wave. heat wave like you've never seen before, not recorded probably in human history, but credible because of climate change that could happen to Pasadena. How would this change our plans? We've been talking several times about Goodrich receiving station and what happens if it's partially disabled and the throughput is limited through that station. We have in this IRP assumed, or will assume to be correct, the cost of new resources. Now, that cost of new resources comes to us, again, from a documented source, which gives us a moderate, high, and low. We start off with a moderate in our scenarios, but what if, in fact, they turn out to be closer to the high end of the scale of price? What happens if they gravitate toward the low end of the scale? This sensitivity test will show that. Sensitivity tests, again, are expressed in a table that you see here for easy reference. The idea is to apply each sensitivity test one by one to a particular scenario. So hit it with one thing, hit it with another thing. What happens if the prices are high? What happens if the prices are low? And see how each of those affects that scenario. So again, this is for your reference. When you call up this PowerPoint slide deck, please read it at your leisure, but it's a nice summary of what the sensitivity tests are trying to do. The IRP is much more than simply running scenarios. There are many, many other subjects that we will discuss, which is why it's probably going to be a long report. We jokingly refer to it here at PWP as the 200-page book. And in that book, there will be multiple chapters on things that we need to consider just on a what-if basis, or what may be involved, or what we'd have to consider, or what will be affected. And those things include, among many, many other things, this is just a small portion of the list, the effect and role of demand response. For each scenario result, what is the price tag applied to that? I mean, what is the price tag resulting from that, and how that translates to rates if rates were to cover the sole source of revenue to cover that revenue need. Rooftop solar and residential batteries we mentioned before in the context of what we would probably see normally and what might happen if somehow we could manage to double the adoption rate behind the meter. Community solar along the lines of what I talked about, we'll discuss that more at length in the text of the IRP, as well as how electric vehicles are a load to the IRP and possibly how they could contribute to the IRP in terms of vehicle to grid contributions to the resource stack. Where are we on the IRP right now is that we're pretty much wrapped up on the data assumptions. We pretty much know what they're going to be and the data that's going to go into the scenarios as we model them. What the scenarios are going to be themselves is almost set in stone. Once they are, we'll be able to actually do the computer runs and model the algorithms. While that is happening, as a parallel effort, we're beginning to write that report, that 200-page book, starting with the chapters that are not directly affected by the output of the scenario runs. So we know pretty much how they're going to read. Things such as, what are the environmental requirements upon the city of Pasadena? Well, we know that. We need to write that up, and that will be a chapter in the book. Why wait? Let's write it up right now. So we are beginning to do that job right now. How long is this going to take? Well, the idea is that we have some results, hopefully, sometime in June, beginning to come in from the scenario runs. We'll continue meeting with various parties, including you, the public. We hope to be pretty much done informationally with the IRP in about August, July or August, so that we could have an actual report in presentable form. It would go to the Environmental Advisory Commission and then go to the Municipal Services Committee, culminating in an offering to the City Council. Here is our report. First, you adopt the report. Secondly, what do you recommend the course of action that we follow given this report? And our job isn't done until the IRP is filed with the California Energy Commission, and we aim to do that before the end of this calendar year. We'll be meeting again with you. The plan is in June, late June of this year, by which time we plan to have finalized what the scenarios are, the ones you saw earlier on the screen, along with the sensitivity test that you saw on the screen, and be able to hopefully to show some results of some of the scenario runs, beginning with the reference case. What are they finding? What's beginning to come out of the computer simulations? Also, by that point, I hope that we will have progressed enough in writing the IRP report so that we can talk about what it's shaping up to look like, and we'll update our schedule to show you when things are also shaping up to occur along the remaining portion of 2023. So that's where we are right now, and I believe it's time to open it up to questions again.
Thank you, John. I have
go.
a little bit of some backtracking to do here just to make sure that we get through as many of these as possible. So John, this question is in reference to the slide that you showed showing source mix in future years. And the question is, does the chart showing source mix in future years reflect the recent contracts for geothermal and solar, or is that modeled elsewhere?
It reflects the recent contract for solar and storage. The contract for geothermal has not yet been formally approved by the City Council. When it does, we can add it to this particular one. Actually, you know what? It does show, now that I think about it, it does show with the expectation that it's going to be approved. I just remembered that 15 years at 25 megawatts. It's in there.
Is reflected in that slide.
It's in there.
Thank you for that clarification. Is there modeling to show increase of RECs in future years? What has recent direction increase of RECs been over the last 3 years?
Very generally, RECs are tied to our energy supply. Our energy supply is tied to load growth. So that's the quickest answer. It pretty much looks like the load growth curve in shape.
John. I think this question has been asked and answered, but I just want to ensure, do these graphs represent resources that are currently under contract?
With the exception of the geothermal, which we hopefully will be under contract in a matter of a month or two. Yes, they are.
Okay. What are the cost differences between rooftop solar, community solar, and utility scale solar?
I don't want to be quoted on the numbers, although I have them at the top of my head. Suffice it to say that utility scale solar per megawatt installed is several times cheaper than community solar per megawatt installed, which in turn is several times cheaper than residential. That's what I remember. And if I made a misstep between community and distributed, please, rooftop, please help me out on that, Nettie, because I'm not including in community solar the cost of the carport itself. But I think that's how they stack up.
And John, just
so I would.
Yes.
Sorry, go ahead, Robert.
I'm sorry, just on clarification for that, I think the STAG members sent a file report, and it's delineated in there for the STAG members, and it does kind of mirror what you just described.
Okay.
Thank you, John. What is PWP doing to take advantage of the huge amount of funding provided through the IRA? Does the city of Pasadena have any plans to create its own solar energy?
Answer to the first question, the funding is not provided. It's being offered. To be able to get it, we have to apply for it. We are planning to file a grant proposal to the federal government to get some funding for these projects. And yes, PWP is planning one way or another to install some of its own solar. For example, the community solar I was telling you about would be installed by PWP and would be connected to the PWP distribution system directly. It would be in front of the meter, not behind the meter.
Thank you, John. I just want to acknowledge we do have a couple hands up, but I do have some questions that are still awaiting answers. So I'm going to read through a few more questions, and we see you with your hands up, and we look forward to getting to you soon. John, can you please elaborate on whether the social cost of carbon is included in contracted power as well as demand market purchases?
It is currently included in neither of those. Anything else?
PWP could help with distributed energy sources by advancing community solar gardens. Although PWP mildly encouraged this concept a few years ago, the department abandoned the effort. Why was the initiative abandoned then, and what is the thinking now?
Let me not address history. After all, I myself have been in PWP for less than a year, so it wouldn't be in my place to talk about history. What I can talk about is community solar looks like a real possibility because it's a current technology, because we have identified prospective sites for it, and because it could make a measurable contribution to the internal portion that is within Pasadena of any resource portfolio. That's why we're looking at it now.
Thank you, John. Before I read these two questions, I want to clarify that these come two different questions from two different participants, but they came in succession. So the first one is, number one, what number is used for the social cost of carbon? And number two, does the social cost of carbon include the social benefit of carbon, or is it purely focused on the costs?
Okay. The answer to the first question is the EPA shows three different series of costs, and that is costs in this year, that year as time goes on. And the three different offerings are differentiated by a discount rate, and PWP has chosen to take the discount rate with the highest prices. And that's what's going to be incorporated. What was the other part? Oh, yeah. Social cost of carbon is a cost. A benefit has not been established, but if you look at it, avoiding the cost is in effect a benefit. So you can look at it that way.
Thank you, John. What is being assumed about demand reduction through energy efficiency improvements in buildings?
It's a column of specific numbers that appears in each year, and energy efficiency is a part of the load forecast. And it's a specific prediction, and it will be shown in the IRP. Those actual numbers.
Thank you,
actual
John.
Forecasts.
Are we acquiring the batteries because previous IRPs said we would?
Correct me if I'm wrong, Robert, but the idea in our current RFP is, well, we were talking about this back and forth. One was to have the developer own it with an option to buy later on by PWP. I don't know if that applies to this 25 megawatt tranche, but we were at one time considering it. I would think, and this is only my opinion, that in future installations, the batteries would be owned by PWP.
If I could clarify, I wasn't so much asking about who would own it, but is the idea of getting a bunch of batteries because the previous IRP said we would do it, or can we come up with new ideas that don't have anything to do with previous IRPs?
This new IRP will only in the very briefest terms refer to other IRPs. This 2023 IRP will stand on its own.
But the RFP
it will be valid as if there were no other
IRP.
as if there were no other previous IRPs. It would look freshly at the issues.
But I think the RFP is going to go out before the IRP exists. So I'm just asking, do you have to have IRP authority to do something like that, or can you just decide to do it?
We can just decide to do it. This is a form of early action. We're going to have to do a lot more than this, so we're getting started early.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Bob. I have one more here, and then I do see two participants with their hands raised. We're back. This is another question about the social cost of carbon. Does price fluctuations include fueling fossil fuel plants, meaning the volatility of fossil fuels?
I think if I interpret it right, the real question is what is the forecast of fossil fuel prices to be used? The fossil fuel price forecast is one of the inputs to the study, and it will be shown in the IRP. And it is priced per year and by type of fuel.
Thank you, John. At this time, I am going to call on Sam B. Sam, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hey, everyone. Just for everyone's awareness, I'm a member of the Stakeholder Technical Advisory Group. It's good to see everyone. So I did an analysis a couple of weeks ago that found that the data being used for some of the carbon-free resources in your modeling was as much as 29% higher than the source data that you were using. And I was wondering if you've made any progress on understanding this discrepancy.
The short answer is yes, we have. The longer answer is ACES has provided an analysis, which we plan to show you and the rest of the STAG members, which will explain the discrepancy.
Thank you.
We'll be sending it soon, probably by email.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you. And I see Jamie S. with a hand up. Please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, thanks very much. Yeah, so this is a question of process. And what I wanted to know was, the STAG is kind of there giving you kind of a second set of eyes and perspective outside of PWP. And they're getting pretty heavily into the details, like what Sam just brought up to you.
Yes,
and
they are.
I'm wondering about, in terms of process, what is the outcome when there's, let's say, information going into scenario? Because the outcome, the outcome of the scenarios is going to drive the city council's decision making, I would think. And so when there is a discrepancy or a disagreement between PWP and members of the STAG on the meaning of something or the value of something, how do you see that getting resolved ultimately?
As with any diverse group of people, we cannot assume that everybody will 100% totally agree on anything on that. We recognize that. And that includes us in PWP too. So with open minds, we propose what we think is a good solution on any particular question. We get input from the STAG. And remember, the STAG is just one of the groups who provide input to us. We try as impartially as we can to pick the best answer that will meet all requirements. Reliability, affordability, council resolution, what will actually meet it. We're not paying lip service to it. We're making an honest effort to address this. What would do that? We model these in the scenarios. The scenarios give us results that give everybody food for thought. If we do this and that, we can take parts of scenarios to see what we should and shouldn't do. Big example of that is the social cost of carbon. We present all the results in the IRP in an easy to read format saying if you do it this way, the cost will be this, the impact will be that, we'd have to do this other thing. And it's sort of a mix and match kind of thing that's made available to policymakers. And in this case, the policymakers are the city council, who will look at the entire report and then weigh in on what course of action PWP should follow. That would then devolve to a cost of service study, which in turn would go into our next rate ordinance proposal. So that's pretty much a chain of events.
Yeah, I wasn't asking about the chain. I was asking about the discrepancies. So you're basically saying, in the end, you guys just decide what you're going to put into your models.
What is the best decision for all Pasadenans?
According to you. Okay.
According to us, somebody has to make the decision. So why not those who are closest to the study, which is PWP?
And actually, I did want to weigh on that a little bit, where we do have expert consultants, ACES, as well as industry experts like Mr. Hermosi, who's been in the business 40 years. So if there's anybody who knows more about resource planning than Mr. Hermosi, I haven't quite met him yet. Locally.
Or what about, for instance, outside experts as well, being brought in independently?
I think NREL is one of those outside experts that are being consulted, and I think their reputation is above board.
And that, by the way, is in addition to these subcontractors to ACES that are providing them with expert information that they can turn around and use in the IRP.
Thank you all. I do have a few more questions in the queue here. Please say more about the, quote, community solar, unquote, commercial solar idea. Is there any concern about grid congestion with this? Can you share something about how PWP would be involved in organizing this?
Okay, this time of night, you have to help me out, feeding me these questions one at a time. I can start with the one. The commercial solar is different from community solar. Commercial solar is on the customer side of a commercial service. So it's going to be at a customer site. Community solar is going to be in some other location, but it will be directly connected to the PWP distribution system. So that's a big difference between the two. Another difference, by the way, is the commercial solar is likely to be owned by the ratepayer. Community solar would be owned by PWP before being farmed out to community participants.
And John, is there any concern with grid congestion with this?
Short answer is, given the throughput, the amount of megawatts we're talking about, not currently.
And can you share something about how PWP would be involved in organizing this?
That's going way into the future. The thinking about it is very preliminary.
Okay.
But we'd start with the ways in which we currently interact with customers, like what we do with rebate and subsidy programs for things that are not directly connected to rates.
Thank you. Does the EPA social cost of carbon calculation recognize any benefit of increased CO2 concentration? For example, increased crop yields have been noticed in past years, notwithstanding drought conditions in the area of study.
Not having performed the study, I cannot categorically say it does. It appears to me that it does not. It does not consider CO2 a good thing.
Okay. In the upcoming modeling, will the social cost of carbon, will it be used for both energy market power as well as contracted power in the reference scenario plus cost of carbon? Will cost of carbon be included in the CF 2030 scenarios?
Currently, social cost of carbon is being attached to the scenario that produces the most carbon, which is the reference case. And it is being used as a simulation of how the resources would be dispatched. There is currently no market for social cost of carbon. So there's no physical existing mechanism for people to buy and sell social cost of carbon as there is for RECs.
Thank you very much. I had a question about the just the order of questions being taken. I'm trying to go by the timestamps here. I appreciate your patience as I'm going off 3 different lists, but we're going to try to get to as many people as possible. I do see Sam B has a hand up.
Hey again. I just want to clarify the one you just had, I believe, from Sandy. So is the social cost of carbon going to be used for contracted power as well in that scenario?
John, if you don't mind, I'm going to go ahead and answer that question. So in that particular scenario, the social cost of carbon will be applied to purchases from the market. And that's because there's a certain level of carbon intensity that's associated with those market purchases. The social cost of carbon would not be applied to any contracts that Pasadena has for carbon-free resources, like their solar or wind contracts. And John, I'll defer to you.
Yeah, I think we have to move on because I don't know how many people we have in line with questions. How many do we have, Kelly?
I have one more in the chat that was.
This question was asked 3 times. I just want to clarify really quick and ask why it's not going to be included in fossil fuel contracts such as Glenarm.
It would be included in fossil fuel contracts such as Glenarm. I thought the question referred to the market purchases, but no, any fossil fuels would have, or any landfill gas or any sort of carbon emitting resource would have the social cost of carbon applied.
And that's in the simulation.
In the simulation, yes.
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Sam. Is there a significant opportunity for commercial solar with batteries inside of Pasadena?
The judgment call. Is there? I think that I'm only giving you my opinion that there could be, and that storage bonded with generation of solar PV energy is much more valuable to Pasadena than the PV solar alone. So I can tell you that from that point of view, there is a great value. Where there is great value, there is space or cause for an incentive. But that's all my opinion because we don't have such a program yet. But it's something to be considered in the IRP report.
Thank you, John. And then we had an additional question here. Previous IRPs have included substantial spot market purchases. I don't know ISO rules. Is it even possible to buy carbon-free power on the spot market? If not, I assume spot purchases will go to 0 in new CF 2030.
So the answer to the first question is practically none. And the answer to the next part of the question is practically yes. We will have to be more dependent upon our own sources because only those we can count as far as carbon content is concerned.
Okay, and then we had one more about spot market purchases. What about spot market purchases? How do you apply SCC to that market where we know that the majority of the electricity is from FFS, but not all?
We have to make an assumption generally in these studies, and correct me on this, Nettie, if I'm wrong, that we deem them to be carbon-fueled resources, or there's some deemed carbon content percentage that we apply as an assumption to all of them.
First of all,
sorry,
Nettie,
Kelly.
please. My apologies, please.
There are projections about what the future of the grid could look like in terms of fossil fuel versus renewable breakdowns. And so we take a look at where the grid is headed in the future. And based on that, we can calculate a carbon intensity for the market. And so that would be the carbon intensity that we apply the social cost of carbon to.
I wanted to thank everyone for their patience as I do my best to get through these lists. And I saw Sandy K had a hand up, and I just wanted to ensure. I saw the hand raised earlier. I wanted to make sure that
the question was addressed. Thank you.
Okay.
Very much for letting me know.
Kelly, how many questions do we have in chat? How many hands do we have raised?
Okay, at this time, I do not see any hands raised. And
one just came up.
One just came up. Fantastic. We have one hand raised, and it is at this time, I believe the last question that I read was time-stamped at 7:52. It's now 7:54 p.m. I would like to just share that I have been following the timestamps on the different chats. Oh, I just had one more come in, but we had a hand raised before that. This one's just a quick procedural notice. Are these STAG meetings noticed on the city's website?
No, they're not official city meetings.
Okay.
So they're made known only to the STAG members.
I want to thank everyone for the positive comments that are coming in. I really appreciate it. And we do see one hand raised here, and I just want to give the opportunity for anyone else to get in the queue as we are coming up on 8 o'clock. And I'm going to call Cynthia C. Please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, PWP team, for staying late and all of your intense work on this. My question is about the scenarios. And, I'm on the STAG, as you know, but we've raised this question before about the scenarios. And I am still not understanding kind of the difference between 1 and 2. We sent you an analysis indicating that scenarios 1 and 2 appear to have conflicting assumptions. One assumption was indicated in the slides you sent, where it said that scenario number 1 would prioritize utility scale solar due to cost. The other assumption you gave was that scenario 2 would maximize local generation despite the cost. And that seems in conflict. If you wanted to maximize local generation, but add a limit, wouldn't it make sense to add a minimum and a maximum limit on scenario 2 and a minimum threshold on scenario 1? And then I also have a question about scenario 3. We heard ACES say in the last meeting that you're trying to double distributed generation, which is fantastic. We like that. But maybe somebody misspoke. I mean, the statement that I heard very clearly was that the way you're going to do this is have the city actually pay to install rooftop residential, which, would make this an extremely costly scenario, and it would seem to kind of kill the scenario. So if you could comment on those two questions about the scenarios, that would be much appreciated.
Okay, we got 3 minutes left in this meeting. So let me assure you that those questions have written answers that have already been drafted.
Okay.
And they'll be sent to you and the other STAG members. On the second of your questions, very briefly, no, it's not carved in stone. It's not necessarily what we're going to do as a way to pay for the additional distributed solar. Not necessarily. That's just an idea that came out. It may not be the method actually described in the IRP.
Okay, we'll get more on that then, I guess. Thank you.
You will.
And I see Denise J with the hand raised. Denise, are you able to unmute yourself?
Yes, sorry, that was on me. You should now be able to unmute yourself, Denise.
Denise, I'm going to pop over to another question. If you're able to unmute yourself, just go ahead and speak. And we will pause for you. For a black swan event like a giant heat wave, do you count the possibility of spot purchases to meet the need?
That will depend upon where we are in the study period.
Denise,
it's going to be before or after the end of 2030 when that happens.
Okay.
And we should be close to wrapping it up, Kelly-O. Just wanted to notify.
Denise,
thank you.
Do you want to have the last question?
I think they might be having a few technical problems unmuting, but
otherwise, Kelly, have we gone through all of the questions that we've received so far?
I have one more, which is internal resource options. Community parentheses, utility scale, and parentheses, solar, 4-hour storage. That's from a slide in today's presentation. Community or utility scale. John said they're different. So what is community, in parentheses, utility scale solar?
Okay. Actually, the way that PWP would implement it, community solar, is a form of utility scale solar in that it would be installed by the utility and owned by the solar installation itself. Often when we say utility scale, it's a measure of the size of this. And just as a general rule of thumb, 1 megawatt and larger is considered utility scale. It may be that some of this community solar would be installed by PWP, but not be of that size because you have to find whatever locations are available. So it's possible that something will be utility installed, but not utility scale, but still be installed within city of Pasadena. But whatever you call it, that's a possibility that we're going to be studying in this IRP, this kind of installation.
Thank you, John. And thank you, everyone, very much for making the time to join us for this conversation about the Power IRP this evening, and especially for your thoughtful questions and informative feedback. As our team shared, this is the second in a series of community meetings, with our next meeting tentatively scheduled to take place on June 22. And please stay connected as we confirm that date and provide the link on our website, which is pwpweb.com/power IRP. And in the interim, we're available by email at WPD_IRP@cityofpasadena.net. You can email me directly. I'm Kelly O'Rourke at KOROURKE@cityofpasadena.net. Or you can reach us by phone at 626-744-4005. Thank you and good night.